the summer of 1565, the Mediterranean Sea was the most fiercely contested body of water on Earth. It served as the center of global trade, wealth, and imperial military power. Control over these waters meant control over the vital intersections of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Dominating this maritime arena was the Ottoman Empire, ruled by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. By the mid-16th century, Suleiman had expanded his empire to stretch from the borders of Austria deep into the Persian Gulf and across the northern coast of Africa. His military war machine was unparalleled in its scale and efficiency. The Sultan commanded virtually unlimited wealth, vast fleets of heavily armed galleys, and armies comprising tens of thousands of highly disciplined soldiers. The Ottoman forces were thoroughly accustomed to sweeping aside any kingdom or army that dared to stand in their path. Opposing this superpower was a small, militarized Catholic order known formally as the Knights of St. John and widely recognized as the Knights Hospitaller. Originally established as medics serving in Jerusalem during the Crusades centuries earlier, the Knights had gradually evolved into an elite brotherhood of state-sponsored Corsairs. They operated from a tiny, barren rock situated in the center of the Mediterranean Sea. This island was Malta. Malta possessed almost no natural resources, no rivers, and very little arable land to sustain a large population. However, its exceptionally deep natural harbors made it a perfect naval base and fortress. From this rugged outpost, the Knights of St. John relentlessly raided Ottoman shipping lanes. They routinely intercepted trading vessels, disrupting the flow of goods, gold, and captives that helped fuel the Sultan's sprawling empire. Malta lay right at the strategic bottleneck between Christian Europe and the Islamic East. For the Ottoman Empire, capturing the island would definitively remove a persistent, highly aggressive threat to their vital trade networks. Additionally, seizing Malta and its magnificent harbors would provide the Ottoman fleet with a highly secure staging ground. From there, they could seamlessly launch a direct invasion into southern Europe, beginning with the nearby island of Sicily and moving straight up the Italian mainland. The collision between these two fundamentally opposed forces was inevitable. On one side stood an irresistible military juggernaut determined to secure total, unquestioned dominance over the Mediterranean Sea. On the other side stood just a few hundred heavily armored warrior monks supported by a few thousand local Maltese militia and Spanish foot soldiers. They were dug into thick stone fortifications, fueled by religious zeal and prepared to fight to the last man standing. The resulting confrontation would escalate into one of the most brutal and bloody sieges in military history, testing the outer limits of human endurance. Part 1. The Relentless Corsairs and the Sultan's Wrath. The animosity between the Ottoman Empire and the Knights Hospitaller spanned several decades before the Armada ever set sail for Malta. The roots of this specific conflict stretched back 43 years to the eastern Mediterranean island of Rhodes. In the year 1522, a young and highly ambitious Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent launched an invasion of Rhodes, which at the time served as the heavily fortified headquarters of the Knights. The Sultan brought an army of over 100,000 men to dislodge the Christian order from his immediate maritime borders. The ensuing siege was exceptionally brutal and lasted for 6 exhausting months. The Knights fought with such ferocious tenacity that they inflicted terrible casualties on the Ottoman forces, earning the begrudging respect of the young Sultan. When the surviving Knights finally negotiated a surrender in December of 1522, Suleiman granted them generous terms. He allowed the surviving members of the order to board their galleys and sail away with their weapons, their religious relics, and their honor intact. Suleiman believed he had permanently neutralized the threat they posed to his empire, driving them out of his domain forever. Following their expulsion from Rhodes, the Knights Hospitaller became an order without a home. They spent 7 years wandering the courts of Europe, desperately petitioning various monarchs for a new base of operations from which they could continue their holy war. Finally, in 1530, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V offered them a permanent solution. He granted the Knights sovereign control over the Mediterranean archipelago of Malta, along with the heavily contested North African port city of Tripoli. The annual tribute required by the emperor was symbolic, consisting of a single trained hunting falcon to be presented to the Viceroy of Sicily every year. When the knights first arrived in Malta, they were profoundly disappointed. Unlike the lush and wealthy island of Rhodes, Malta was a barren outcrop of yellow limestone. It lacked rivers, possessed very shallow soil, and was incapable of producing enough food to sustain its own population, let alone a militarized order of knights and their retinues. Furthermore, the existing defenses were crumbling and woefully inadequate. However, the island possessed one strategic advantage that altered the trajectory of the order. The northern coast of Malta featured a series of deep, sheltered natural inlets forming fine, deep-water harbors. Realizing they could not survive on the meager agricultural output of the island, the knights turned their focus to the sea. They rapidly transformed from heavily armored cavalrymen into highly skilled, extremely aggressive naval combatants. The order invested heavily in building a fleet of swift, heavily armed war galleys. To sustain their economy and finance the fortification projects required to defend their new home, the knights fully embraced the practice of corsairing. Corsairing was the state-sponsored, religiously sanctioned plundering of enemy shipping. While the Ottoman-aligned Barbary corsairs operated out of North African ports like Algiers and Tunis, striking Christian shores and seizing European vessels, the Knights of St. John did the exact same thing in reverse. Operating out of Malta's Grand Harbour, the Knights systematically hunted Ottoman merchant ships, intercepted trading convoys, and occasionally launched daring raids directly onto the shores of the Ottoman Empire and its vassal states. When the knights captured an enemy vessel, they seized its cargo to fill their own treasuries. They also took the captured crews, utilizing them as enslaved oarsmen to power their ever-expanding fleet of galleys. This cyclical economy of maritime raiding turned the Mediterranean into a zone of constant, terrifying low-level naval warfare. Over the decades, the knights became increasingly bold and highly successful, transforming the waters between Europe and Africa into a highly perilous gauntlet for Islamic merchants. Among these seafaring warrior monks, several captains rose to prominence, but none became as feared or as notoriously successful as Mathurin Romegas. Born into an aristocratic family in southern France, Romegas joined the order and quickly demonstrated a ruthless, unparalleled genius for naval combat. He commanded his own galley and routinely sailed straight into the heart of Ottoman-controlled waters, utilizing a combination of extreme aggression, superior sailing techniques, and highly disciplined boarding parties. Romegas became the ultimate terror of the Ottoman trade routes. He captured hundreds of Muslim vessels, enslaved thousands of Ottoman sailors, and amassed a fortune for the order. His exploits became legendary across the Mediterranean. He regularly fought and defeated some of the most seasoned Ottoman naval commanders, surviving storms, shipwrecks, and countless boarding actions. For the administration in the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, Romegas was much more than a mere nuisance. He was a humiliating symbol of Christian defiance, operating right in the middle of what the Sultan considered his personal sea. The large volume of wealth and the number of high-ranking Ottoman subjects captured by Romegas placed enormous political pressure on Sultan Suleiman to finally swat this irritating pest. The situation reached a boiling point in the middle of 1564. Romegas was commanding a squadron of the Knights' galleys, actively patrolling the waters near the Greek islands, deep within the eastern Mediterranean. During this patrol, his lookouts spotted a large, heavily armed Ottoman merchant galleon. This large transport ship, known as a mahon, functioned as a floating fortress armed with 20 large cannons and carrying a substantial detachment of crack Janissary infantrymen for protection. More importantly, the galleon belonged to Kustem Aga, the chief eunuch of the Sultan's imperial harem. The chief eunuch was one of the highest-ranking and most influential officials within the Ottoman government. The cargo hold of this ship was packed with a fortune in luxury goods, spices, and precious silks sourced from across the east. Furthermore, the venture was heavily financed by prominent members of the Sultan's own court, including several of his senior ministers and, crucially, the Sultan's own daughter. Despite the overwhelming size and heavy armament of the Ottoman galleon, Romegas ordered an immediate attack. The ensuing naval battle was exceptionally brutal and lasted for several hours. The heavy cannons of the Ottoman ship wreaked havoc on the smaller, lower Christian galleys, tearing through wood and flesh. However, Romegas utilized his superior maneuverability to close the distance. He led his heavily armored knights in a desperate boarding action. Fighting hand-to-hand across the blood-slicked decks of the ship, the knights eventually overwhelmed the Janissary defenders and captured the vessel. When Remegas triumphantly towed the prize back into the grand harbour of Malta, the celebration among the knights was deafening. The value of the captured cargo was astronomical, providing a large influx of wealth for the order. However, the diplomatic and political fallout in Constantinople was immediate and explosive. When news of the capture reached the Ottoman court, the reaction was pure fury. The investors who had lost large sums of money demanded retribution. The chief eunuch, publicly humiliated by the loss of his flagship, relentlessly pressured the Sultan to act. The women of the harem, including the Sultan's daughter, actively lobbied Suleiman, arguing that the empire's honor had been violated by a handful of pirates operating from a tiny rock. Furthermore, the local religious leaders in Constantinople preached that it was the Sultan's duty as the defender of the faith to ensure the safe passage of Muslim pilgrims who were increasingly afraid to travel by sea to Mecca due to the aggressive raiding by the knights. Suleiman the Magnificent was now 70 years old. 43 years prior, he had shown the knights mercy by allowing them to leave Rhodes alive. It was a decision he now regretted. The continued existence of the Knights Hospitaller was an open challenge to his authority, a disruption to his economy, and a stain on his legacy. In the autumn of 1564, Suleiman convened his ruling council. He announced that the era of tolerance was over. He issued direct, irrevocable orders to the shipyards of Constantinople and the arsenals of the empire. They were to immediately begin construction on a large fleet and army. The target was set. The Ottoman war machine would sail in the spring of 1565, and their objective was the annihilation of the Knights of St. John and the conquest of the island of Malta. Part 2. The Commanders, the Armada, and the fatal strategic blunder. As the Ottoman war machine mobilized in the east, the defense of Malta rested on the shoulders of one man. Parisot de Valette was the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, and at 71 years of age, he was a hardened, uncompromising warrior. Valette was born into an ancient noble family in southern France, but his adult life had been defined by a relentless, violent struggle against the Ottoman Empire. He possessed a deeply personal understanding of his enemy, forged through decades of brutal experience. In 1522, as a young knight in his 20s, Valette had stood on the walls of Rhodes and survived the agonizing 6-month siege led by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He had witnessed firsthand the overwhelming scale of Ottoman artillery and the disciplined terror of their elite infantry, the Janissaries. Furthermore, he remembered the bitter sting of surrender and the humiliation of being forced into exile. Even more formative than his experience at Rhodes was a terrifying incident that occurred in 1541. While commanding a galley off the coast of North Africa, Valette was engaged in a fierce naval battle with Barbary Corsairs. His ship was overwhelmed, and he was taken prisoner. For an entire year, the future Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller was chained to a wooden bench as a galley slave, forced to row an Ottoman warship across the Mediterranean Sea. This horrific ordeal was a highly unusual fate for a high-ranking nobleman who would typically be ransomed almost immediately. Surviving a year in the squalid, agonizing conditions of a 16th-century galley gave Valette a profound, visceral understanding of Ottoman naval operations, logistics, and psychology. He endured starvation, exposure to the brutal Mediterranean sun, and the constant threat of the overseer's whip. This experience stripped away any lingering notions of chivalry or mercy. By the time he was finally freed in a prisoner exchange, Valette had become a man of iron resolve. He knew exactly what the Ottomans were capable of, and he was prepared to inflict the exact same level of brutality upon them. When Valette received intelligence from his network of spies in Constantinople that an armada was being assembled, he immediately instituted a ruthless, island-wide, scorched earth policy. Malta was a highly vulnerable target, and Valette understood that the harsh Mediterranean summer would be his greatest ally if he could actively deny the invaders essential resources. He issued strict orders to the Maltese peasant population to harvest all crops across the island, regardless of whether the grain was fully ripe. Any crops that could not be harvested and brought safely inside the fortified walls were to be crushed and burned. He ordered the slaughter of livestock that could not be sheltered. Most crucially, Valette understood that an army of tens of thousands of men would require large quantities of fresh water to survive the blistering heat. He commanded his forces to systematically poison every single well and freshwater spring situated outside the fortress walls. They threw bitter herbs, hemp, dead animals, and raw sewage into the water supply, ensuring that the arriving Ottoman army would immediately face a severe logistical crisis and the rampant spread of disease. Simultaneously, Valette desperately fortified his positions. The knight's primary defences were concentrated around the Grand Harbour, a complex body of water on the eastern coast of the island. Within this harbour were two narrow peninsulas jutting out into the water, known as Songléa and Bégou. The knights had established their headquarters, their arsenals, and their civilian population centres on these two peninsulas, surrounded by deep ditches and thick stone walls. However, the entrance to the Grand Harbour was guarded by a separate, much smaller fortification situated on the tip of a rugged promontory known as Mount Cheberas. This was Fort St. Elmo. It was a modest, star-shaped fort built specifically to secure the harbour mouth. Inland, positioned in the centre of the island, sat the ancient walled capital city of Mdina, which housed a small garrison of cavalry and served as a communication hub with the outside world. Valette recalled every single available knight from their estates across Europe, frantically stockpiled gunpowder, and prepared for a brutal siege. In the spring of 1565, the Ottoman armada finally sailed from Constantinople. It was a fleet of terrifying proportions, arguably one of the largest naval forces assembled since antiquity. Close to 200 heavily armed vessels darkened the horizon, consisting of large war galleys, fast galleots, and transport ships carrying a vast invasion force. The exact numbers vary in historical records, but the army consisted of roughly 30,000 to 40,000 fighting men. This included 6,000 elite janissaries, the highly disciplined, musket-wielding shock troops of the Ottoman Empire who were feared across Europe. They brought huge siege cannons, including basilisk guns capable of firing solid stone spheres weighing over 150 pounds. The logistics of the fleet were complex, transporting thousands of tons of gunpowder, massive quantities of food, and an army of engineers, miners, and labourers required to conduct a prolonged technical siege. However, the power of this armada was fundamentally undermined by a critical flaw in its leadership. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, perhaps wary of investing too much military power in a single individual, had purposefully divided the command of the expedition between two different men with contrasting backgrounds and priorities. Commanding the land forces was Mustafa Pasha, a veteran general. Mustafa was a man of the old guard, aged 65, and possessed decades of battlefield experience fighting across Europe and Asia. He had previously served as a personal tutor to the sons of the Sultan, granting him a respected position within the Ottoman political hierarchy. Mustafa was a highly pragmatic and aggressive tactician. His military career was built on capturing territory, neutralizing enemy strongholds, and executing decisive land-based campaigns. He viewed the siege of Malta purely through the lens of a land war, where securing the island's interior and cutting off the enemy's resources was the highest priority. In stark contrast, the commander of the Ottoman fleet was Piali Pasha. Piali was significantly younger, highly ambitious, and politically untouchable. He owed his rapid ascent not just to his naval competence, but to his extremely advantageous marriage to the granddaughter of Sultan Suleiman. This royal connection meant that Piali enjoyed a level of political protection that even the veteran Mustafa Pasha could not challenge. Piali was primarily a naval man, and his singular motivation during the campaign was the safety and preservation of the Sultan's extraordinarily expensive fleet. He viewed the land war as secondary to ensuring his ships were protected from the unpredictable, highly destructive Mediterranean winds and the persistent threat of Christian naval reinforcements. On May 18, 1565, the Ottoman armada dropped anchor off the southern coast of Malta. The sight of the hundreds of galleys and transport ships filling the horizon sent a wave of terror through the local population, who frantically rushed behind the fortified walls of Bégou, Singléa, and Mdina. Valette ordered his troops to hold their positions, refusing to engage the army on the open beaches. Almost immediately upon landing, the divided command structure of the Ottoman forces fractured. Mustafa Pasha and Piali Pasha convened a council of war on the rocky shores of the island to determine their immediate tactical objectives, and they aggressively clashed over the fundamental strategy of the campaign. Mustafa Pasha surveyed the island and proposed a highly logical, orthodox military plan. He argued that the Ottoman army should immediately march inland and lay siege to the ancient capital of Mdina. Mdina was lightly defended compared to the large fortresses surrounding the Grand Harbour. Mustafa reasoned that capturing the capital would neutralize the Knights' cavalry, which was currently using Mdina as a base to launch highly disruptive hit-and-run attacks against Ottoman scouting parties. Furthermore, taking Mdina would cut off all communication between the Knights and the island of Sicily to the north, preventing any requests for reinforcements. Once the interior of the island was secured, Mustafa planned to systematically march his army back to the coast and choke the life out of the primary fortresses of Birgu and Senglaya from the landward side. Piali Pasha adamantly refused this plan. He pointed out that the fleet was currently anchored in open water off the southern coast, exposed to the sudden violent storms that frequently swept across the Mediterranean during the changing seasons. If a major storm were to hit while the army was marching inland, the Sultan's magnificent fleet could be smashed against the rocky shores and utterly destroyed. Piali insisted that before the army took a single step toward Mdina, they had to secure a safe, deep-water anchorage for his galleys. The best available anchorage was Marsamxett Harbour, located directly to the north of the Grand Harbour. However, the entrance to Marsamxett Harbour was dominated by the Knights' small, star-shaped fortification, Fort St. Elmo. Piali Pasha demanded that the Ottoman war machine halt its inland advance and instead focus its terrifying might on destroying Fort St. Elmo. He argued that the fort was small, isolated, and highly vulnerable to a concentrated artillery barrage. He assured the council that the elite Ottoman gunners would reduce the small stone structure to rubble in a matter of 3 or 4 days. Once the fort was eliminated, the fleet could sail safely into Marsamxett Harbour, and then Mustafa could proceed with his land campaign, having secured a highly protected logistical base. The argument between the two commanders was intense, reflecting the deep divide between the naval and land priorities of the empire. Mustafa Pasha opposed delaying his land campaign to attack a fortified position that offered almost no strategic value to the army itself. However, he could not simply overrule Piali. Piali's status as a member of the royal family by marriage, combined with his direct command of the fleet that served as their only lifeline back to Constantinople, gave him overwhelming political leverage. Furthermore, Piali invoked the direct orders of the Sultan, who had instructed the commanders to protect the fleet at all costs. Faced with this immovable political reality, Mustafa Pasha was forced to compromise. He reluctantly agreed to delay his march on Mdina and shift his army toward the rocky peninsula of Mount Shabares to lay siege to Fort St. Elmo. Mustafa genuinely believed the assessment of his engineers, convinced that the tiny fort could not withstand the concentrated firepower of the Ottoman basilisk cannons for more than a few days. This decision would prove to be one of the most catastrophic strategic blunders in the history of 16th century warfare. By focusing their war machine on Fort St. Elmo, the Ottoman commanders handed the tactical initiative directly to Jean Parisot de Valette. They allowed the knights inside the primary fortresses of Birgu and Senglaya precious weeks to further strengthen their defences, stockpile supplies, and mentally prepare for the onslaught. More importantly, they underestimated the structural resilience of the star-shaped fort, and they failed to comprehend the fanatical, suicidal determination of the men defending it. The Ottoman army dragged their siege guns across the rocky, sun-baked landscape of Malta, aiming them directly at Fort St. Elmo. They expected a swift, decisive victory that would secure their fleet and allow the real war to begin. Instead, they were marching directly into a horrific, month-long meat grinder that would break the momentum of the invasion, decimate their elite ranks, and alter the trajectory of the Great Siege of Malta. Part 3. The Meat Grinder of Fort St. Elmo. On May 24, 1565, the Ottoman army began dragging their siege artillery across the rugged limestone of Mount Shabares. Their target was Fort St. Elmo, the small, star-shaped fortification positioned at the tip of the peninsula, guarding the entrance to the crucial anchorages of Malta. The Ottoman engineers constructed heavily fortified trenches and gun emplacements, steadily inching their cannons closer to the fort. Among these weapons were the dreaded basilisks, enormous siege guns capable of hurling solid stone spheres weighing upwards of 150 pounds. When the bombardment finally commenced, the volume of firepower was unlike anything previously witnessed in the history of Mediterranean warfare. Dozens of heavy cannons opened fire simultaneously, creating a deafening continuous roar that could be heard clearly on the island of Sicily, nearly 60 miles away across the open ocean. The strategy of Mustafa Pasha was straightforward. He intended to pulverize the sandstone walls of Fort St. Elmo into fine dust, burying the small garrison of knights and Spanish infantry beneath their own defenses, and then overwhelm whatever remained with a large infantry assault. The Ottoman gunners maintained a relentless, punishing rate of fire, pounding the star-shaped fort day and night without a single moment of respite. Within the first week, the outer walls of St. Elmo began to crumble, fissures opening in the stonework as the relentless kinetic energy of the heavy stone cannonballs took its toll. However, the Ottoman commanders quickly realized they had made a miscalculation regarding the resilience of the defenders. As the pristine stone walls collapsed into sloping mounds of rubble, the resulting debris actually absorbed the impact of subsequent cannonballs much better than rigid vertical stone. The knights and their soldiers utilized the cover of darkness to desperately shore up the breaches, dragging timber, earth, and the bodies of the dead to plug the gaps in their defenses. When the Ottoman artillery paused and the elite Janissary infantry charged forward to storm the breaches, they did not find a broken, demoralized enemy. Instead, they were met with a terrifying barrage of 16th-century incendiary warfare. The Knights of St. John were masters of close-quarters combat, and they utilized a horrific array of chemical weapons designed specifically to exploit the flowing robes and dense formations of the Ottoman assault troops. As the Janissaries poured into the defensive ditches and attempted to scale the rubble, the defenders hurled earthen pots filled with wildfire, a highly volatile, primitive form of napalm composed of pitch, saltpeter, and sulfur. When these pots shattered against the rocks or the bodies of the attackers, they ignited into unquenchable flames that stuck to flesh and fabric. Even more devastating were the incendiary hoops. The knights constructed large wooden rings, bound them tightly with highly flammable materials, soaked them in oil and gunpowder, and set them ablaze. Using long iron tongs, the defenders would hurl these flaming hoops down into the tightly packed ranks of the advancing Ottoman infantry. A single hoop could ensnare 2 or 3 soldiers at once, setting their clothing on fire and causing panic in the tightly congested breach. The screams of the burning men mingled with the roar of the cannons, turning the ditches around Fort St. Elmo into a literal vision of hell. Despite inflicting horrific casualties on the attackers, the garrison inside Fort St. Elmo was suffering terribly. The small fort was overcrowded, devoid of safe shelter from the plunging artillery fire, and filled with the choking stench of black powder, burning flesh, and decaying bodies. Sleep was impossible. The men fought continuously for days on end, sustained only by their religious fervor and the desperate knowledge that surrender was out of the question. As the casualties mounted and the structural integrity of the fort vanished, the surviving knights realized their position was ultimately hopeless. Under the cover of darkness, the garrison commanders dispatched small boats across the Grand Harbour to the main fortress of Birgu, carrying desperate messages for Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette. They pleaded with the Grand Master to allow them to evacuate the ruined fort, arguing that they had already held out far longer than anyone expected and that their lives could be better utilized defending the primary walls of Birgu and Senglaya. They warned that if they were forced to remain in St. Elmo, they would simply be slaughtered to the last man. Valette received these pleas and responded with a cold, terrifying calculus that defined his leadership throughout the siege. He denied their requests to evacuate. Valette understood the brutal arithmetic of the situation. Every single day that the Ottoman war machine remained bogged down, attacking the tiny, isolated peninsula of Mount Shebaraz, was a day they were not attacking his civilian population and his main fortifications. Furthermore, every day the siege dragged on pushed the Ottoman timetable closer to the treacherous autumn months, when the Mediterranean storms would force the enemy fleet to withdraw or face total destruction. Valette coldly ordered the garrison of St. Elmo to remain exactly where they were and fight to the death. To ensure the fort did not immediately collapse, Valette utilized the small stretch of open water between Bergu and St. Elmo to smuggle in small numbers of fresh troops and essential supplies under the cover of darkness. He was intentionally feeding his own men into a meat grinder, perfectly willing to sacrifice hundreds of lives to buy precious weeks with the rest of the island. The dynamic of the siege shifted dramatically in the first week of June with the arrival of the legendary Corsair commander, Dragut. At 80 years old, Dragut was the most feared, experienced, and respected naval commander in the Islamic world. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had specifically ordered Mustafa Pasha and Piali Pasha to consult with Dragut on all major tactical decisions. When the elderly Corsair arrived and surveyed the trenches dug around Fort St. Elmo, he was furious. He immediately recognized the fatal strategic blunder the two commanders had made by delaying the inland march to attack such an insignificant target. However, Dragut also understood the brutal realities of military morale. The Ottoman army had already committed thousands of lives and weeks of labor to the siege of the fort. To simply pack up the cannons and abandon the effort now would be a devastating blow to the pride and fighting spirit of the army. They were committed, and Dragut decided he had to finish the job as quickly and violently as possible. Dragut immediately took overall command of the siege operations and restructured the artillery bombardment. He ordered the construction of new artillery batteries on the high ground of Mount Shaberaz and on the opposite side of the Marsamchet harbour, creating a multi-directional crossfire that pounded Fort St. Elmo from 3 sides simultaneously. More importantly, Dragut recognized how Valette was keeping the fort alive. He identified the exact route the knights were using to smuggle fresh troops across the water at night. Dragut ordered his engineers to construct a heavily fortified trench down to the water's edge and positioned a battery of heavy cannons specifically trained on the harbour crossing. With this single tactical adjustment, Dragut severed the lifeline between Birgu and Fort St. Elmo. No more reinforcements could get in, and no wounded men could be evacuated. The small garrison was now cut off, surrounded by tens of thousands of enemy troops and subjected to a ferocious artillery bombardment. By the middle of June, Fort St. Elmo had ceased to exist as a functional military structure. It was simply a jagged pile of pulverized limestone, defended by a few hundred exhausted, starving, and wounded men. The Ottoman assaults grew more frequent and desperate. On June 18th, Mustafa Pasha ordered a general assault on the ruins. Thousands of Janissaries swarmed the breaches, leading to a day of horrific hand-to-hand combat. The defenders held the line, fighting with pikes, swords, and whatever debris they could lift, successfully repelling the attack. However, during the intense bombardment that accompanied this assault, a crucial turning point occurred. While Dragut was standing in one of the forward siege trenches, actively directing the artillery fire against the fort, a cannonball smashed into the rocky ground nearby. The impact shattered the limestone, sending a jagged splinter of rock flying through the air. The stone shrapnel struck the 80-year-old Corsair commander directly in the head. Dragut fell to the floor of the trench, bleeding profusely and drifting in and out of consciousness. The loss of their greatest and most feared tactical mind sent a shockwave of dismay through the Ottoman High Command. Dragut was quietly carried back to his command tent, where he would linger on the edge of death for several days. Despite the loss of Dragut, the weight of numbers eventually overwhelmed the defenders. The climax of the month-long siege arrived on the morning of June 23, 1565. The Ottoman guns fell silent. The surviving defenders of St. Elmo, knowing exactly what the silence meant, dragged themselves to the shattered walls for the final time. Those who were too severely wounded to stand requested to be placed in wooden chairs, positioned right in the center of the breaches, holding their swords and pikes, determined to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. The Ottoman army surged forward in an overwhelming wave. The fighting was brief and devoid of mercy. The Janissaries flooded over the rubble, slaughtering the remaining knights and soldiers where they sat or stood. Within hours, the banner of the Knights Hospitaller was torn down from the highest pile of rubble, and the banners of the Ottoman Empire were raised over the conquered promontory. Fort St. Elmo had finally fallen. When Mustafa Pasha walked through the smoking, blood-soaked ruins of the fort, he was confronted with the grim reality of his victory. The Ottoman engineers had originally estimated that the fort would fall in 3 or 4 days. Instead, it had taken a full month of continuous, horrific warfare. Thousands of the Sultan's finest soldiers, including some of the most experienced Janissary veterans, lay dead in the ditches surrounding the tiny fort. Standing in the ruins, Mustafa Pasha allegedly looked across the waters of the Grand Harbour toward the untouched walls of the primary fortress of Bergu, realizing the monumental task that still lay ahead. Furious at the delay, the staggering casualties, and the defiance of the Christian defenders, Mustafa Pasha decided to engage in a display of extreme psychological warfare. He wanted to shatter the morale of the knights waiting in the main fortresses and send a clear message about the fate that awaited them. He ordered his soldiers to gather the bodies of the highest-ranking knights who had fallen in the final assault. The Ottoman troops stripped the bodies and decapitated them. Using their swords, they slashed deep gashes across the chests of the corpses in the shape of a Christian cross. The headless, mutilated bodies were then nailed to heavy wooden planks. As the tide shifted later that day, the Ottoman soldiers pushed these gruesome rafts into the water, allowing the currents to slowly float the crucified, headless knights directly across the Grand Harbour toward the walls of Birgu. From his command post, Grandmaster Jean Parisot de Valette watched the wooden planks drift across the water and bump gently against the stone docks of his fortress. The psychological blow Mustafa intended to deliver failed to break the old Grand Master. Instead, it triggered a response of unparalleled brutality. Valette understood that this siege had fundamentally transcended traditional warfare. There would be no negotiations, ransoms, or quarter given by either side. Valette immediately dispatched his guards into the dungeons beneath Birgu, where the knights held their Ottoman prisoners of war. Without a trace of hesitation, Valette ordered every single Ottoman prisoner to be executed. The guards dragged the captives from their cells and beheaded them. Valette then ordered his gunners to gather the severed heads of the Ottoman prisoners. The gunners carried the bloody trophies up to the highest ramparts of the fortress and forcefully rammed the severed heads into the barrels of their largest cannons. With a thunderous roar, the cannons of Bergu fired their gruesome ammunition across the harbour, sending a horrifying shower of Ottoman heads crashing directly into the enemy lines on Mount Shiberaz. This single, horrific exchange of mutilated bodies and severed heads firmly established the reality of the Great Siege of Malta. The month-long meat grinder of Fort St. Elmo had cost thousands of lives and completely derailed the Ottoman timetable, yet the primary fortifications of the island remained unbreached. As the blistering heat of the Mediterranean summer fully set in, both sides knew that the true battle for the survival of Malta was only just beginning. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.